Uh, okay, my name is Furrukh Khan. This is me saying Assalamu alaikum, Namaste, Sat Sri Akal, good evening to our audience uh, from all over the world, and I'm speaking from Pakistan. Uh, this is a very warm welcome for the fourth season of Sunday Stories Live. I am, extremely honored, humbled, and as I said earlier, sometimes that bit nervous doing this. But today I'm really very excited and very happy to be here. Just a little bit about myself. Um, I teach post-colonial studies at Lahore University of Management Sciences. My PhD is on partition, but much more important than that, my parents come from border areas with India, और जो मेरी माँ का गांव था that was in Gurdaspur before the partition, and through one way or the other, this was something which became more than kind of just a personal चीज, एक academic चीज भी रही है. Um, अगेन अब 20-25 साल 30 साल हो गए हैं इस चीज़ को काम करते हुए. इन दैट I've interviewed many people, read different things, थोड़ा सा फिल्म मेकिंग में भी किया है, and I've been associated with Partition Archive for a number of years. And this particular project, they have conducted over 10,000 families ke interviews. And if you are interested in finding out more, please visit the archives website or speak to one of our members here. So, kind of turning back to the reason why we are here, why I am here, is that it's truly an honor for me that I get a chance to speak with Professor Veena Das, someone whose work I have used, and I'm someone. And again, मैं थोड़ा सा उनको embarrass भी करूँगा that I'm in awe of the work that she does, and I'm fortunate enough to have seen her carry out जो field work जिसको हम कहते हैं. मैं अभी students को भी मैं बता रहा होता हूँ कि अगर कोई magician है तो it's Veena Das. So I'm very happy and honored. इनका बहुत लंबा सा जो है वो इंट्रोडक्शन होना है, बट उसको मैं with maybe kind of उसको मैं थोड़ा सा छोटा इसलिए करूँगा that I would prefer that we speak with her, and she talks about her work. So Nadas is a Krieger Eisenhower Professor of Anthropology at Johns Hopkins University, and before joining here, she was at Delhi School of Economics for more than 30 years. She's also had a joint appointment at New School for Social Research. She's a fellow of American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and of Academy of Arts and Sciences of the Academy of Scientists from Developing Countries. She was awarded the John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship. So वो बहुत सारी लंबी इनका जो है वो एसोसिएशन विद एकेडमिया, विद राइटिंग अबाउट नॉट जस्ट पार्टीशन, बट ये और भी चीज़ों के ऊपर काम कर रही होती है. हर रिसर्च कवर्स अ रेंज ऑफ फील्ड्स, कलेक्टिव वायलेंस के ऊपर, अर्बन ट्रांसफॉर्मेशंस is some of the stuff that she's done. Affliction, health, disease, poverty, इनके ऊपर she's co-edited 3 volumes, The Ground Between, Anthropologists Engage with Philosophy, Living and Dying in the Contemporary World, and Politics of Urban Poor is something that's forthcoming. Her graduate students are working on a number of issues in different parts of the world, and her work is deeply informed by her heady interactions with them. So, again, with this short and abbreviated introduction, Professor Veena Das, seriously, मेरे दिल तो आवाज आ रही है कि it is such an honor to have you here, and thank you so much for taking out the time being here. Okay, so again, maybe as we start from all things, partition. What would you think is your connection with partition? How would you tell our audience? I mean, again, I know some of this stuff, but for our audience, what is your connection with partition?
First, thank you, Furrukh. It's an absolute honor to be here, and I think it's a amazing work that the work on the Partition Archive that is being done. I think it really makes all of us very proud of the energy that people have put into that, and I feel very proud of the fact that this is one topic that actually united many scholars across India and Pakistan to think that we really have to collaborate and cooperate in thinking about our joint histories. And I think your energy and your work has been absolutely exemplary in this. For me, it's a my relation to partition, I would say, is an elusive relation in the sense that my family was from Lahore, and clearly they migrated. There were people who were killed within the joint extended family and within my own family, and so there were all those adjustments of which children will grow up with whom and so on. But partition was never talked about. And actually, uh, one got hints of something in the past, which was more like, a kind of fantasy world, more or less, in the sense that the wars had happened with Pakistan, and there was, at that time, always this kind of very celebratory thing कि जी हुंता असी जाके वापस और जाके अपने अपने जो अच्छा छड़ के आया और सारा कुछ जाएंगे, but no one ever explained what it was, right? And in my own work, I would say I didn't set out to study partition. I like to think that it found me. And it found me because I didn't realize that so much of what I was observing was in some ways a result of the kinds of traces of relationships which had become embittered, which had become regretful. There was a lot of nostalgia, and there were also fantastic networks of support that, after the partition, I wouldn't have survived if, in fact, I had not been given a home by my close relatives who were not themselves in particularly strong financial positions in some ways. So on the one hand, there was that entire thing that in the fieldwork that I was first doing with Punjabi families in 1970s, my first book was actually on more on the Sanskrit. I mean, the simpler Sanskrit which was used in Gujarat to write caste Puranas, and it was more on the structure of Hinduism in these texts. And I'll come to that connection too. But it was when I was working on family, in these were migrant families who had clearly had networks which were urban networks. So some members were not affected directly by the partition, but others were. They had lost their homes, they had lost their families, and so on. And it would appear in terms of something which would be elusive, because women's speech was always very elusive around these questions, right? So, for example, I have described in my book a woman who had been abducted and then later rescued by the army. And her mother, and she had obviously been quickly married off to a older relative, because many marriages were done in that way, so that there was no opprobrium which would come in the way of the girls getting married. But her mother-in-law would often kind of taunt her by saying कि जी औरत दा की है होता मर्द दी गू खाती है, right? Which is, what is it? She eats just the shit of man. And I remember her saying once कि माँ जी ऐसी तो रोटी खाने हैं. We eat bread, right? We
mm,
eat tea. Those were the kinds of kind of things which could be placed in the present, typical mother-in-law, daughter-in-law kind of tension, but it also embedded in itself a deeper history, it seemed to me. And so my work in some ways became that. And then at the age of 12, I discovered Manto. And Mando had just such an influence on me. And I'd read other literature like Jhuta Sach and and Bhishma Sani and so on. But Mando was the one who really gripped me completely. And this
mm,
connection with Sanskrit is interesting because I didn't know who my father was for a very long time. I knew him only as an uncle, but he had been, family had been displaced, my mother had died, and so on. And he had for a while become this kind of ice cream seller on the streets, right? And the family was, but it's a generosity in some ways of my parents. I mean, my adoptive parents, they're the ones I think of as my parents, that they allowed him to come every morning. He would come every morning to teach me Sanskrit, right? And it took me a while to realize that my great love for Sanskrit was that it was perhaps the only connection I had with that kind of lost family, so to say. And it's taken me a lifetime to actually discover that. So it's a complicated relationship. I can't just say this is my direct relation
mm.
to partition.
इसी में एक और चीज का आता है दैट व्हेन वन टॉक्स ऑफ पार्टीशन, जो फर्स्ट इमेज जो है वो दिमाग में वो आ रहा होता है, इट्स ऑफ अ कलेक्टिव, एवरीथिंग ऑलमोस्ट दिस ऑन बिब्लिकल स्केल कि जी जितनी दूर नजर जा रही थी काफला आ रहा था और जो वो खून भी इतना हुआ, सो एवरीथिंग इज, I don't know, one doesn't want to call it exaggerated, but this is something which comes up again and again. But जो आपका काम है, that kind of almost is a complete opposite, कि वो individual के ऊपर आ जाता है, as you're talking about, और individual की story के ऊपर आ रहा है. So again, why why would you do that? I mean, wasn't it easier just because everyone else was doing that? आपने ये distinctive, and this is something I think which is for me, at least for someone who's been using your work for over two more than 2 decades, uh, कि जो आपकी स्टोरी में आते हैं इज द काइंड ऑफ द इथोस के लिए इंसान को समझने की, उसकी दर्द को समझने की कोशिश हो रही होती है, जो नॉर्मली एकेडेमिया में नहीं होता. तो सो माई थिंग इज, ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਕੀ ਜ਼ਰੂਰਤ ਪਈ ਹੈ ਇਹ ਚੀਜ਼ ਕੱਢਣ ਦੀ, ਤੁਸੀਂ ਇਹ ਚੀਜ਼ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕਿਉਂ ਪੈ ਗਏ?
I don't know if you remember when you visited Delhi, I took you to some of the slum areas
I will
where
never forget that. I will never
I,
forget that.
I don't know if you remember this woman who I introduced her and I said, "जी मेरे बहुत अच्छे दोस्त हैं पाकिस्तान तो आए हैं." And she turned around to you and she said, "तुसी बुरा ना मानना, पर मुसलमानों ने ना साढ़े नाल ठीक नहीं किया." And you said, "बुरा क्यों मानेगा, वो मेरी मामा लगदे सी." And it was such an interesting moment for me. Like, the fact that if you talk to Muslims, they will say the Hindus did not do it properly. उन्होंने पता सी जी वो तो अपने सारा जो भी खजाना सी जो कुछ हुई थी ना गहने सब लेके पहले ही चले गए सी. So
बड़े होशियार होंगे.
kind of ways in which a certain veiling happens, and I think that what happens with these very exaggerated language that people would often use, and for me that came, I asked this woman who I call Manjeet. I said, "तुझी तो तब काफी छोटे सो, you were quite small. ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ कुछ याद है partition ਦੇ बारे ਚ?" So she said, "हाँ क्यों नहीं याद है, याद है, मैं कल आवांगी ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਦੱਸਣ ਵਾਸਤੇ." And she came really dressed very formally and she had written out something. And it was all precisely that, जहाँ तक नजर जाती थी वहां तक खाली खून के फुहारे बह रहे थे, जहां तक नजर जाती थी खाली सफेद कफन नजर आते थे, and so on and so forth. But her story was a very different one, right, in some ways. So I think that what happens with these very abstract generalizing kinds of notions is that there's already that mediation of a certain kind of imagination of mass depths which comes to obscure personal stories. And part of it was the fascination in some ways with horror, by which certain things were always obliviated from familial memories. The fact of the matter was that a lot of men were crazed by the fact that they had lost their wives, or they had, left a daughter behind. And many times they would sort of describe कि मैं जी फिर टर्बन लगाई, मैं पगड़ी इस तरह बंदी, मैं दाढ़ी भी ग्रो की ते मैं चला गया लाहौर ढूंढन ਉਹਨੂੰ ਤੇ मैं कोई ਪੁੱਛਦਾ ਸੀ ਤੇ मैं अपने आप ਨੂੰ मुसलमान ਕਹਿੰਦਾ ਸੀ, right? So where were those stories? All the stories were about honor, ਕਿ ਜੀ ਕੁੜੀ ਘਰ ਆਈ ਤੇ ਦਰਵਾਜ਼ਾ ਖੋਲਿਆ ਤੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਕਿਹਾ ਤੂੰ 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 ਕਿਉਂ ਵਾਪਸ ਆਈ ਹੈ, ਤੂੰ ਤਾਂ ਮਰ ਜਾਣੀ ਤੇ ਅੱਛਾ ਹੋਣਾ.
Marjan Changas.
That was the gripping story. But there were a whole lot of other things which made up, and that was what Manto captured in a story like Koldo. This thing that the father's absolute joy that it doesn't matter if the daughter's body is contaminated. She's my daughter. She's alive. Right? The sadder part of it. I mean, if you ever read Batalvi's Punjabi poetry, he never writes directly on the partition. But he will say things like kabra udik diya mainu jo mawa nu, jo putra nu mawa, right? Where that is the contamination of kinship that has happened in some way, right? Or his maine mai maik shikra yaar banaya, right? Where he says, that when jab unhe pair rakhe na te tandi chadar maili ho gayi, right? It's like as if the kind of taint on masculinity, in a certain sense, continues into the idea that this aspect was also present in relationships and was not quite ever attended to. Right? And so it both brought out certain things, I think, in people's lives quite explicitly in some ways. This I describe in one of my books, this woman I call Sita, who's, when she's dying on the deathbed, she says, don't let the shroud come from my brother's house. Now, for Punjabi Hindu to sort of say that natal family se nahi aayega kafan is like disowning the entire relationship, right? But and I think she expected that no one will really act on it. But she wanted, and I think it was related to the fact that she was like, her brother used to go out and say, koi Musalman aaye na, to tu egg kha lena, leaving her with poison. And I think that is what really, are these fragments which kind of stay in people's lives.
मैं ऐसी चीज में थोड़ा डेमो और भी करना, but again for our audience, you are watching Sunday Stories live from the 1947 Partition Archive. Professor Veena Das is our guest. My name is Furrukh Khan. What we will do is we will speak. I will speak with her for the next maybe 15 minutes, 10 or 15 minutes more. And if we have comments or questions, please put them up in our chat box, and we will and try to see how many of those can be answered. Again, coming back to ਇਹ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਰਿਲੇਸ਼ਨਸ਼ਿਪ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਦੱਸ ਰਹੇ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਹੋ, ਆਈ ਥਿੰਕ ਪਾਰਟੀਸ਼ਨ ਦਾ ਜਦੋਂ ਅਗਰ ਇੰਡੀਵਿਜੂਅਲਸ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਲੈ ਆਂਦਾ ਜਾਵੇ ਤੇ ਆਦਮੀਆਂ ਦੀ ਤੇ ਔਰਤਾਂ ਦੀ, ਐਂਡ ਉਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਉਹੀ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਆਦਮੀਆਂ ਦਾ ਹੀ ਡਿਸਕੋਰਸ, ਐਂਡ ਦੇयर ਇਜ਼ ਇਨਫ ਰਿਟਨ ਅਬਾਊਟ ਦੈਟ ਕਿ ਅੱਛਾ ਜੀ ਮੇਲ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਵਾ ਉਹ ਫੀਮੇਲ ਬੋਡੀ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਇਨਸਕ੍ਰਾਈਬ ਕਰਦਾ ਆਪਣਾ ਨੈਸ਼ਨਲਿਜ਼ਮ, ਕਮਿਊਨਲਿਜ਼ਮ, ਇਹ ਵਗੈਰਾ, ਉਹ ਸਾਰਾ ਕੁਝ ਕਰਦਾ. ਬਟ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਵਾ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਇੰਨੀ ਦੇਰ ਬਾਅਦ ਗੱਲ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਸੀ, ਇੱਕ ਚੀਜ਼ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਹੈ ਉਹ ਅਗੇਨ when one was studying these different things, ਉਹ ਆਉਂਦੀ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਆਦਮੀ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਨੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਇੱਕ ਡਿਸਕੋਰਸ ਬਣਾਇਆ ਦਾ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਜਿਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਉਹ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਵਾ ਕਿ ਜੀ ਮੈਂ ਆਪਣੇ ਹੱਥਾਂ ਨਾਲ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਨਾ ਆਪਣੀ ਬੀਵੀ ਨੂੰ, ਤੇਰੀ ਬੇਟੀ ਨੂੰ, ਤੇਰੀ ਫਲਾਣਾ ਨੂੰ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਜਿਵੇਂ ਸ਼ਹੀਦ ਕਰ ਦਿੱਤਾ, ਮਾਰ ਦੇ, ਜੋ ਜੋ ਵੀ ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਕਰਦੇ। ਬਟ ਦ ਥਿੰਗ ਇਜ਼, ਮੈਨੂੰ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਆਉਂਦਾ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਵੀ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਅਗਰ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਇੰਨਾ ਡੇਂਜਰ ਸੀ ਤੇ ਫਿਰ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਕਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਬਚ ਗਏ? ਹਾਊ ਕਮ in more cases than not, ਜਿਹੜੇ ਐਟਲੀਸਟ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਬਾਅਦ ਸਟੋਰੀਆਂ ਆਉਂਦੀਆਂ ਨੇ, ਉਹ ਇਹ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਵੀ ਇਹ ਮਾਰ ਕੇ ਤੇ ਇਹ ਆਪੂ ਬਚ ਜਾਂਦੇ ਨੇ। ਅਗਰ ਆਨਰ ਸੀ ਤੇ ਫਿਰ ਤੁਸੀਂ, ਮੈਂ ਅਗਰ ਮੈਂ ਆਦਮੀ ਦਾ ਇੰਨਾ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ ਮੈਂ ਕਹਿੰਦਾ, ਮੈਂ ਫਿਰ ਆਪਣੇ ਆਪ ਨੂੰ ਵੀ ਮਾਰ ਲੈਂਦਾ ਕਿ ਅੱਛਾ ਯਾਰ ਮੇਰੇ ਲਈ ਵੀ ਜੀਣਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਉਹ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੈ। ਸੋ ਆਈ ਡੋਂਟ ਨੋ ਕਿ ਵੀ ਅਗੇਨ ਉਹ ਪਾਰਟੀਸ਼ਨ ਇੱਕ ਇੱਕ ਕਿਸਮ ਹੈ ਜਿਹਨੂੰ ਆਈ ਥਿੰਕ ਉਹ ਬਹੁਤ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਨਾ ਆਲਮੋਸਟ ਕਾਈਂਡ ਆਫ ਉਹ ਓਪਨ ਅਪ ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਕਰ ਦਿੰਦੀ ਜਿਹਦੇ ਆਨਸਰਸ ਨਹੀਂ ਮਿਲਦੇ। ਸੋ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਪਾਰਟੀਸ਼ਨ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਇੰਨੀ ਦੇਰ ਦੇ ਕੰਮ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਹੋ, ਵਾਇਲੈਂਸ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਕੰਮ ਕਰਦੇ ਹੋ, ਪਾਰਟੀਸ਼ਨ ਦਾ ਆਫਟਰਮੈਥ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਕੰਮ ਕਰਦੇ ਹੋ, ਇਹ ਚੀਜ਼ ਨੂੰ ਕਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਦੇਖ ਰਹੇ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਹੋ ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਆਦਮੀਆਂ ਦਾ ਵਾ ਉਹ ਹੈਜ਼ ਡਜ਼ ਇਟ ਚੇਂਜ ਓਵਰ ਟਾਈਮ ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਨੇ ਇਹ ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਕੀਤੀ ਦੀਆਂ ਨੇ? I don't know ਕਿ ਇਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਮੇਰਾ question ਕਿੱਥੇ ਹੈ, but I mean like that's something which always kind of runs around in my head, and I was wondering if maybe if you could address that.
I think that's an amazingly interesting insight that you have over here, which is, there was one man I remember talking to, and he started with this bravado, KG, I ਪਹਿਲੇ ਤਾਂ ਜੀ ਉਹਨੂੰ poison ਦੇ ਦਿੱਤੀ ਪਰ ਉਹ ਮਰੀ ਨਹੀਂ, ਤੇ ਫਿਰ I took her glass bangles, ਉਹਨੂੰ ਕੁੱਟ ਕੇ ਬੋਲ ਕੇ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਪਿਲਾਇਆ, and that was a very painful death, ਪਰ ਉਹਨੇ ਇੱਕ ਵਾਰ ਵੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਕਿਹਾ, ਇੱਕ ਚੀਖ ਵੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਨਿਕਲੀ ਉਹਦੇ ਨੂੰ। So then I said, so did it ever occur to you ਕਿ ਉਹ ਬਚ ਵੀ ਸਕਦੀ ਹੈ? ਮਤਲਬ ਕਿਸੇ ਮੁਸਲਮਾਨ ਫਰੈਂਡ ਨਾਲ ਹੀ ਗੱਲ ਕਰ ਲੈਂਦੇ ਕਿ ਬਈ ਤੁਸੀਂ, ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ ਸ਼ਾਦੀ ਕਰਾ ਦਿੰਦੇ ਆ, ਕਿ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਆਪਣੇ ਘਰ ਰੱਖ ਲਓ ਜਦ ਤੱਕ ਮਤਲਬ ਹੈ ਮਸਲਾ ਥੋੜਾ ਸੋਲਵ ਨਾ ਹੋ, ਜਦ ਤੱਕ ਵਾਇਲੈਂਸ ਕਮ ਨਾ ਹੋਏ। ਤੇ ਕਹਿਣ ਲੱਗੇ ਨਹੀਂ, ਉਹ ਤਾਂ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਕਦੀ ਅਕਰ ਹੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਕੀਤਾ। ਬਟ all his life was tormented by the fact that he did not allow that to emerge in one sense. But there were many, many others who did that, right? I mean, who's who were in the. That's why there's always that question whether hiding in the Hindu family is a Muslim girl, or whether somebody who's a very Kattar Hindu actually had thought about becoming a Muslim, right? And then decided against it for whatever reasons. But as a result, he sacrificed his children or he sacrificed his wife. And as a result, his adherence to a very, very Kattar kind of Hinduism and the hatred of Muslims is related to his own kinds of, inner issues that he failed to act, right? But there were also, I know of somebody who's remembers they had contracted with a truck driver who had said कि मैं ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ border ਦੇ ਪਾਰ ਪਹੁੰਚਾ ਦਿਆਂਗਾ, and then he took them to a Muslim village where they were all killed except for this child. He was just a year old, and he says even now that he remembers his mother saying to them, ਸਾਨੂੰ ਕਿਉਂ ਮਾਰ ਰਹੇ ਹੋ, ਸਾਡੇ ਕੋਲ ਤਾਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਕੀ ਦੇ ਸਕਦੇ ਹਾਂ, ਸਾਡੇ ਕੋਲ ਤਾਂ ਮਾਚਿਸ ਦੀ ਤਿਲੀ ਵੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਬਚੀ ਹੋਈ. That's the one sentence he remembers his mother having uttered. And then he was taken up by a Muslim family, and then what name they gave him was Aman, right? Then he was rescued and so on and so forth. And I think that there is something here where the fact that the ideology at one level was pressing you to be one kind of person, right? So there is that kind of veiling of reality, so to say. It's almost as if your access to reality is actually denied in some ways. And so you fill it up with this, whatever this imaginary, or imago, as Khan would say. But those are big words. I think that my effort has been to try and stay close to saying, can you kind of say what happened, right? I tell you how subtle that becomes. I told you my relation to Sanskrit is very strongly mediated by the fact that, this was something that my father had taught me, though I didn't know him to be my father.
mm,
But I one of my nightmares that I have off and on is the fact, like I had this nightmare when just writing on Kalidas and Valmiki. I just finished. Valmiki had read this curse to the Nishad, to this bird, to this hunter who had killed this bird, right? In my this thing, so and Ram is later accused of being like that hunter in Kalidas in very subtle ways. My nightmare was that Ram is tied in these, lot of black threads, एक जाला बनया होया है जिहदे विच tied हैगे हैं ते कहने हैं कि मैं I want to own up to the fact कि मेरे नाल गलती हो गई सी मैनू सीता नू कदी बाहर नहीं करना चाहिए I should not have expired. And पता सी कि वो बिल्कुल प्योर है, she has no, and that he says the way Michana I know her to be sinless, right? And he's saying, but you have to find the right way, right Sanskrit grammatical sentence by which I can own it. And the only sentence that would come in my dream to me was putting Ram in the instrumental case, right? Tena Sita Nirvachita, that is, by him Sita was sent away, right? I couldn't in my dream make that Rama expelled Sita, right? And I was like, why is my Sanskrit so bad that I'm not able to rescue him from this, from what he wants to correct in history?
mm, mm,
And I think that those things I don't know how to analyze, but I know that they are in some ways very profoundly related to the fact that these things are not just something that happens in the mind, they actually happen to the body through and through.
mm. ਇਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਚੀਜ਼ ਦੱਸ ਰਹੇ ਸੀ ਇਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਅੱਗੇ to the audience, this is probably will be my last question. We will then start taking comments. Is ਕਿ ਇੰਨੀ ਦੇਰ ਤੋਂ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਵਾ ਪਾਰਟੀਸ਼ਨ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਵਾਇਲੈਂਸ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਕੰਮ ਕਰਨ ਦੇ ਦਿਓ ਐਂਡ ਕਿ ਵੀ ਮੈਂ ਪੜ੍ਹਿਆ ਦਾ ਅੱਗੇ ਮੇਰੇ ਸਟੂਡੈਂਟਸ ਪੜ੍ਹਨ ਦੇ ਨੇ ਐਂਡ ਯੂ ਆਰ ਕਾਈਂਡ ਇਨਫ ਟੂ ਸਪੀਕ with my class as well, and they are also rightly so. ਮੈਨੂੰ ਸਿਰਫ ਇਹ ਹੋ ਰਿਹਾ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਇਹ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਪਾਰਟੀਸ਼ਨ ਹੈ ਇਹ ਪਾਰਟੀਸ਼ਨ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਕੰਮ ਹੈ ਇਹ ਸਟੂਡੈਂਟਸ ਨੂੰ ਇਜ਼ ਇਟ ਨੈਸੈਸਰੀ ਐਟ ਦਿਸ ਟਾਈਮ ਇਜ਼ ਇਟ ਅਗੇਨ ਬਹੁਤ ਲੋਕੀ ਜਦੋਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਜਦੋਂ ਇੰਟਰਵਿਊ ਕਰਦੇ ਹੋ ਮੈਂ ਵੀ ਇਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਕਰਦਾ ਤੇ ਬਹੁਤ ਸਾਰੇ ਖਾਸ ਤੌਰ ਤੇ ਔਰਤਾਂ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਨੇ ਜਾਂ ਬੁੱਢੇ ਲੋਕੀ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਨੇ ਯਾਰ ਛੱਡੋ ਕੀ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਪੁਰਾਣੀਆਂ ਗੱਲਾਂ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਬਹਿ ਗਏ ਹੋ ਬਟ ਦ ਥਿੰਗ ਇਜ਼ ਇਟਸ ਨੋਟ ਆਲਮੋਸਟ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਕਿ ਉਹ ਦਿਲ ਤੋਂ ਨਹੀਂ ਉਹ ਕਹਿ ਰਹੇ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਬਿਕੋਜ਼ ਦ ਥਿੰਗ ਇਜ਼ ਕਿ everyone wants his or her story or ਜਿਹੜਾ question of agency ਹੈ ਕਿ ਐਫਰਮੇਸ਼ਨ ਤੇ ਹੋਵੇ ਨਾ ਕੋਈ ਬਾਹਰੋਂ ਆ ਕੇ ਕੋਈ ਦੱਸੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਓਕੇ ਫਾਈਨ ਯਾਰ ਯੂਰ ਸਟੋਰੀ ਕਾਈਂਡ ਆਫ ਮੈਟਰਡ ਤੇ ਇਹਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਸਵਾਲ ਇਹ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਕਿ ਵੀ ਇਜ਼ ਇਟ ਇੰਪੋਰਟੈਂਟ ਕਿ ਵੀ ਅਸੀਂ ਯੰਗਰ ਜਨਰੇਸ਼ਨ ਨੂੰ ਨਾਟ ਜਸਟ ਇੰਡੀਆ ਪਾਕਿਸਤਾਨ ਬਟ ਕਿਤੇ ਵੀ ਹੋਵੇ ਪਾਰਟੀਸ਼ਨ ਦਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਵਾ ਇਜ਼ ਇਟ ਇੰਪੋਰਟੈਂਟ ਐਂਡ ਦੂਸਰਾ ਕੀ ਕੋਈ ਲੈਸਨਸ ਇਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਹੈ ਨਾ ਜਾਂ ਇਜ਼ ਇਟ ਜਸਟ ਸਮਥਿੰਗ ਵਿਚ increases the maybe divide which exists what do you think and especially as someone ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਇਹ ਚੀਜ਼ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ very very intimate ਜਿਹੜਾ violence ਦੀ study ਤੁਸੀਂ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਹੋ so younger generation ਲਈ ਕਿਉਂ ਕਰਦੇ
I think that's really quite a profound question that you ask. So there are two models. One is, let's say, the kind of model of Holocaust memories where the assumption is that this must be conveyed to every generation, because this was something special that happened to the Jews, and there's no question that that you can't not attend to the Holocaust if you lived in the 20th century. That if you were in the same century as Hitler, you could not attend to it, right? But also later. My question over here is that there is a difference there between those who would say that experience made me think about how I might be receptive to the experience of those who, who live with the not just memory of slavery in the U.S., but those who live with literally slavery as a living institution in some ways. The fact that the laws banned it doesn't mean that that discourse doesn't actually, or that traces of that don't continue in everyday in life, right? So I don't know whether I want to signal out and say there must be thought about partition. I think that depends upon what you are moved by, but they must be made to see um, what kind of experiences will open them up to thinking about or escaping from very naive views about, which come from a very simple humanitarian appeal to humanitarianism, or some of them come from the idea that these were exceptional events, or some of them which come from the idea that somehow we have now become modern, we've overcome those were barbaric things. To in academia, I mean, the it's very easy in academia to say those were barbaric violences, right? But they were not. They were actually part of the structures of life as they had been developed, and which, in a certain sense, might have been kind of crystallized in some very, very spectacular events at some time, but which actually, when you find that, you have to ask yourself what led to its build up, what was its past, what was its future, right? And so you stretch out you stretch out that event to think about it across time, across space, across persons. So for me, it's not like, oh, there is an object outside you that you get to know. Here is the kind of experience that will wound you. Reading about it will wound you. Really seriously thinking about it will in some ways make you worry about the question of how are you going to find joy in life, right? But then to be able to say that to find joy in life is not to just put suffering or barbarity or this kind of calamities on the side, nor is it that we as the civilized nations, which you can see its reappearance in the discourse on terrorism, we could see its reappearance in so many places. So it's a question of teaching them how to think, in my opinion.
ਇਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਦੋ ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਮੇਰੇ ਦਿਮਾਗ ਵਿੱਚ ਅਸੀਂ ਹੁਣ ਗੱਲ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਸੀ, ਐਕਚੁਅਲੀ ਪਹਿਲੇ ਵੀ ਆਇਆ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਮੇਬੀ ਇਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕੋਈ ਕਲਚਰਲ ਡਿਫਰੈਂਸ ਵੀ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਹੈ, ਜਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਮੇਬੀ ਯੂਰਪ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਓਕੇ ਫਾਈਨ ਕੋਈ ਵੀ ਚੀਜ਼ ਹੋ ਰਿਹਾ, ਵੀ ਨੀਡ ਟੂ ਕਾਈਂਡ ਆਫ ਕਮ ਟੂਗੇਦਰ, ਤੇ ਸਾਡੇ ਐਂਡ ਅਗੇਨ ਦਿਸ ਇਜ਼ ਫਰੋਮ ਅ ਵੈਰੀ ਪੰਜਾਬੀ ਸਾਈਡ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਆ ਰਿਹਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਜੀ ਆਈ ਡੋਨਟ ਨੋ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਉਹ ਕਦੀ ਸੁਣਿਆ ਦਾ ਕਿ ਨਹੀਂ, ਉਹ ਇੱਥੇ ਆਲਮ ਲੋਹਾਰ ਆ, ਉਹਦਾ ਬੜਾ ਮਸ਼ਹੂਰ ਇੱਕ ਗੀਤ ਹੈ, ਉਹ ਕਹਿੰਦਾ ਜੀ ਦਿਲ ਵਾਲਾ ਦੁਖੜਾ ਨਹੀਂ ਕਿਸੇ ਨੂੰ ਸੁਣਾਈਦਾ, ਆਪਣੀਆਂ ਸੋਚਾਂ ਵਿੱਚ ਆਪੇ ਮੁੱਕ ਜਾਈਦਾ। ਸੋ ਉਹ ਵੀ ਕੋਈ ਚੀਜ਼ ਆਉਂਦੀ ਹੈ, ਇਜ਼ ਦੈਟ ਅਗੇਨ ਆਈ ਮੀਨ ਜਨਰਲਾਈਜ਼ਡ ਵਾਲੀ ਚੀਜ਼ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਮੇ ਬੀ ਵੀ ਐਜ਼ ਅ ਪੀਪਲ ਅਸੀਂ ਦੂਸਰੇ ਨਾਲੋਂ ਡਿਫਰੈਂਟ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਕਿ ਅਸੀਂ ਯਾਰ ਆਪਣੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਦਿਲ ਵਾਲੀ ਗੱਲ ਹੈ ਉਹ ਕੱਢੀ ਦਾ ਹੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੈ। ਕੀ ਚੀਜ਼ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਹੈ, ਵਾਈ isn't there kind of maybe more as you said ਕਿ ਇਹ ਚੀਜ਼ ਸਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ ਹੋ ਗਈ ਹੈ, there is no one cannot deny that ਕਿ ਜੀ and again ਉਹ ਲੋਕੀ ਵੀ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਨੇ, these are people who are not these kind of great evil, these are people like us, ਸਾਡੇ ਮਾਮੇ ਚਾਚੇ ये वो वगैरह, people that we know, and then they come back and they come back kind of reintegrated into the society। लेकिन फिर वही है कि ਜਿਹੜੀ propensity for violence, propensity for hate है, if there is anything ਉਹਦੀ manifestation ਤੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਦੇਖ ਲਈਦੀ ਹੈ ਨਾ। ਸੋ ਸਟੂਡੈਂਟਸ ਨੂੰ ਮੈਂ ਕਹਿ ਰਿਹਾ ਨਾ ਕਿ ਇਟਸ ਨਾਟ ਕਿ ਦੀ ਪੁਰਾਣੀਆਂ ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਦਾ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਦੇਖ ਰਹੇ ਹੋ, these are things which happen around us। ਉਹ ਕੱਲ ਨੂੰ ਉਹ ਸਟਾਰਲੇ ਮਿਲਗ੍ਰੇਮ ਜਾਂ ਹੋਰ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਐਕਸਪੈਰੀਮੈਂਟਸ ਵਗੈਰਾ ਅਗਰ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਦੇਖੋ ਤਾਂ ਉਹ ਅਸੀਂ ਵੀ ਉਹ ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਕਰ ਸਕਦੇ ਹਾਂ। ਸੋ ਇਹ ਨਾ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਕਹੋ ਕਿ ਯਾਰ ਹਾਂ 60 ਸਾਲ ਜਾਂ 70 ਸਾਲ ਪੁਰਾਣੀ ਚੀਜ਼ ਹੈ, we are also part of that. So if nothing else, it's just you becoming aware of कि की चीज़ां हुई हैं. So ਇਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚੋਂ ਪਹਿਲੇ मैं just announcement करता है कि जी, to my audience, you are watching Sunday Stories live from the 1947 Partition Archive. Professor Veena Das is our guest. My name is Furrukh Khan. So, for those of you who have questions and or comments for our distinguished guests, please put them in the chat box, and then we will try to answer some of those questions. So, I mean, in the meantime, that questions may come up. ਤੇ ਇਹ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਕਲਚਰਲ ਵਾਲਾ ਜਾਂ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਵਾ ਕਿ ਆਪਣੀ ਚੀਜ਼ ਨੂੰ ਅੰਦਰ ਹੀ ਰੱਖੋ, ਉਹ ਵੀ ਕਿਤੇ ਆਉਂਦਾ ਵਾ ਪਾਰਟੀਸ਼ਨ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਕਿਤੇ.
दोनों important है because ये जड़ा है ना कि जी we have to get the story out of the person. People also have a right to, right to some notion of what is, let me put it like this. There are many ways in which, people have to find ways in which they are comfortable with the expressions that they can give it, right? So say that I mentioned Shiv Batalvi. कितने भी उन्हें partition करके नहीं. Jivanandan Das in Bangla, right? I mean, his whole poetry is seared by partition in some ways. And he has one where he has this thing where he's calling out people. And, you get a lot of Hindu names and you get a lot of Muslim names. Each stands up, so to say, as the dead, right? Or one of his very famous poems, Chil, which is Hi Chil, Shonali Bangladeshe, Ar tumi ude ude kendo na ko dhanshuri nadi tir pashe. So he's thinking about the Chil who ud ke na ro rahi hai, right? रो रो के उड़ रही है, right? And তোমার কান্নার শুনে বেতের ফলের মতন লান চোখ তার মনে আসে, तेरा जद रोना सुनना ना ते ओदा बांस दी तरह दी अखा मन विच आ जांदी है, right? So he's talking about the loss of his lover, right? Who's now Dhanushir Nodi tir pashe, the other side of the river, right? It's a most beautiful rendering of what is it that the division of Bengal did during the partition, right? Um, so there's something there where it seems to me that the expression might not be a direct, as if this is an object you can see before your eyes, right? And so that form of expression, I think, has to be allowed. I think my main anger, actually, and it sometimes verges on rage, I have to say, I try to not, but it does, is against all these scholars who, somehow on the name of saying we are the civilized countries and we will go out and civilize them and we will put democracy in those countries, etc. I mean, do not just see how much violence they have perpetuated, right? Through this very division of civilized violence versus barbaric violence. So, when people like Walzer say that this is the, that you have to have dirty hands because what can you do in the interest of civilization? You sometimes have to do terrible things, right? I just, it's almost like if you're dropping bombs from the sky and killing thousands of people, that's civilized, it's rational, it's planned. But if, in desperation, there is there is kind of a terrorist who is going, and I'm not saying I approve of either, but I'm saying that there is a sense in which you have to overcome this idea that there is somehow or the other, what you said so beautifully, that this is some others who are barbaric, some others who are prone to this, but not us, right? I think if one can teach that in the classroom, to then let them think how they will in relationship to this. I don't want to determine their thought, but I think that's where that's what I think what I've learned as a teacher, and for me, having, I don't know, to be in the classroom is the most exhilarating it's the most exhilarating experience, which is why I've never wanted to take on any high administrative position, because I just love that spark in the eye when somebody says, I see that that's how I need to think more.
ਇਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਇੱਕ ਹੋਰ ਚੀਜ਼ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਹੈ ਸਟੂਡੈਂਟਸ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਹੀ ਅਸੀਂ ਐਜ਼ ਮੇਬੀ ਟੀਚਰਸ ਜਦੋਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਉਹ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਪਾਰਟੀਸ਼ਨ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਇੱਕ ਹੋਰ ਚੀਜ਼ ਆਉਂਦੀ ਹੈ ਐਂਡ ਮੇਬੀ ਲਾਈਕ ਉਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਅਗਰ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਦੱਸੋ ਉਹ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਸਡਨਨੈਸ ਹੈ ਨਾ the kind of that catastrophic moment
Hmm.
ਜਦੋਂ ਚੀਜ਼ ਦਾ ਰਿਅਲਾਈਜ਼ ਹੋ ਜਾਂਦਾ ਓ ਮਾਈ ਗॉड ਇਟਸ ਹੇਅਰ ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਉਹ ਹੁਣ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਦਾ ਦੱਸਣ ਦੇ ਦੇਣਾ ਐਂਡ ਮੈਂ ਆਪਣਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਦੇ ਕੀਤਾ ਉਹ ਕਹਿ ਰਹੇ ਨਾ ਕਿ and the things that people do in just the ordinariness of that for me that is ਜਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਉਹ ਮਾਚਿਸ ਵਾਲੀ ਗੱਲ ਕੀਤੀ ਨਾ ਮੇਰੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਮੈਂ ਜਿਹੜੀ 30 ਸਾਲ ਹੋ ਗਿਆ ਤਾਂ ਦੋ ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਸਟੈਂਡ ਕਰਦੇ ਆ ਇੱਕ ਉਹ ਔਰਤ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਆ ਉਹ ਕਹਿੰਦੀ ਕਿ ਜੀ ਅਸੀਂ ਜਾਂ ਮੇਰਾ ਸਾਡੇ ਲਾਗੇ ਦਾ ਸੀ ਹਰਿੰਦਰ ਮੁੰਡਾ ਸੀ ਉਹ ਆ ਗਿਆ ਤਾਂ ਕਹਿੰਦਾ ਇੱਥੋਂ ਬੇਬੇ ਨਿਕਲ ਚਲੋ ਉਹ ਆ ਗਏ ਨੇ ਜੀ ਮੁਸਲਮਾਨ ਆ ਗਏ ਨੇ ਤੇ ਉਹ ਸਿੱਖ ਆ ਗਏ ਨੇ ਉੱਥੋਂ ਉਹ ਨਿਕਲਦੀ ਉਹ ਕਹਿੰਦੀ ਕੀ ਕਰਦੇ ਕਿ ਜੀ ਮੈਂ ਉੱਥੋਂ ਗਲਾਸ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਨਾ ਉਹ ਚੁੱਕਣ ਲੱਗੀ ਸੀ ਤੇ ਮੇਰੀ ਭਰਜਾਈ ਉਹ ਕਹਿੰਦੀ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਜੀ ਮਾਂ ਇਹ ਸ਼ੀਸ਼ੇ ਦਾ ਗਲਾਸ ਹੈ ਇਹਨੂੰ ਰਹਿਣ ਦੇ ਇਹ ਵੀ ਟੁੱਟ ਜਾਏਗਾ ਕਾਈਂਡ ਆਫ ਜਸਟ ਉਹ ਚੀਜ਼ ਇੱਕ ਹੋਰ ਉਹ ਦੌੜਨ ਲੱਗੀ ਤੇ ਉਹਨੇ ਕੀ ਆਖਿਆ ਜੀ ਆਟਾ ਗੁੰਨਿਆ ਦਾ ਸੀ ਤੇ ਮੈਂ ਚਲੋ ਬੱਚਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਰਸਤੇ 'ਚ ਆਟਾ ਖਿਲਾ ਦਾਂ you think of those things and of all the violence ਜਿਹੜੇ ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਦਾ ਹੋ ਰਿਹਾ ਹੁੰਦਾ
Yeah.
ਕੀ ਚੀਜ਼ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਹੈ how does mind work at such kind of that catastrophic moment
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
ਉਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ I was wondering if you could talk about a little bit about that ਕਿ ਕੀ ਚੀਜ਼ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਹੈ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਇੱਕਦਮ
Yeah.
ਸਡਨਨੈਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ
Yeah, yeah. I think that's an amazing question to ask, and I think the amazing research to be done on that to say what are affective objects, what are the kind of ways in which. So in my family, they lost everything, but they brought photograph album. ਉਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਨਾ ਮਤਲਬ ਐਲਬਮ ਚੁੱਕ ਕੇ ਲੈ ਆਏ
exactly
ਉਹ ਜ਼ਰੂਰ ਬਚਾ ਕੇ ਰੱਖਣੀ ਹੈ in some ways. Very interesting. But there are also other these things there which that thing that the materiality of this object ke shisha hai tut jayega, right, is also speaking about oneself at that moment. I remember Faiz very early moti ho ki shisha jam ki dur jo toot gaya so toot gaya kab ashko se jud sakta hai जो टूट गया सो छूट गया तुम नाहक टुकड़े चुन चुन कर दामन में बिठाए बैठे हो. So there is that sense really of how do we talk to things, but also how things talk to us, which seems to me, and actually that's very, I mean, that's what in a way that I've been trying to think and work on, not just on catastrophic moments, but the fact that what happens to things on TV is different to what happens to things in rituals, is different to what happens to things in kind of everyday life, like the very poor families. ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਯਾਦ ਹੋਏਗਾ ਇਹ ਫੈਮਿਲੀ ਜਿਹਦੇ ਇੱਥੇ ਗਏ ਸੀ ਮੈਨੇ ਇਟ ਇਜ਼ ਦਿਸ ਵਨ ਰੂਮ ਨਾ ਇੱਕ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਪੂਰੇ ਆਪਣੇ ਸਟੀਲ ਦੇ ਬਰਤਨ ਸਜਾ ਕੇ
ਸਫੇਦ ਚੂਹਾ ਯਾਦ ਹੈ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਸਫੇਦ ਚੂਹਾ ਯਾਦ ਹੈ ਸਫੈਦ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਚੂਹਾ ਸੀ
ਉਹਨੇ ਸਾਰੇ ਸਫੇਦ ਚੂਹੇ ਰੱਖੇ ਹੋਏ ਸੀ ਤੇ ਮੈਂ ਸੋਚਿਆ ਕਿ ਸ਼ਾਇਦ ਸਫੇਦ ਚੂਹਿਆਂ ਨਾਲ ਇਹਦਾ ਖੂਬ ਅਟੈਚਮੈਂਟ ਹੈ ਕਿਉਂਕਿ there is a temple in Rajasthan where the goddess loves white choohas, right, white mice. ਤੇ ਉਹ ਟੈਂਪਲ ਵਿੱਚ ਨਾ ਸਾਰੇ white mice ਰਨ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਕੋਲ ਕੁਝ ਨਹੀਂ ਕਰ ਸਕਦਾ ਤੇ ਮੈਂ ਸੋਚਿਆ ਕਿ ਸ਼ਾਇਦ ਉਹਨੇ ਐਸੇ ਪਿੱਛੇ ਰੱਖੇ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਮੈਂ ਪੁੱਛਿਆ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਉਹ ਟੈਂਪਲ ਤੇ ਗਏ ਸੋ ਕਦੀ ਉੱਥੋਂ ਲੈ ਨਹੀਂ ਜੀ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਤਾਂ ਐਵੇਂ ਹੀ ਅੱਛਾ ਲੱਗਦਾ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਯਾਦ ਹੋਏਗਾ ਉਹ ਥੋੜਾ ਜਿਹਾ ਬਿਸਕੁਟ ਉਹ ਚੂਹੇ ਨੂੰ ਦਿੰਦੀ ਸੀ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਡਰ ਗਏ
ਉਹਦੇ ਵੱਡੇ ਕਦੀ ਜ਼ਿੰਦਗੀ 'ਚ ਨਹੀਂ ਸੀ ਦੇਖੇ ਮੈਂ ਉਹਦੇ ਬਾਅਦ ਵੀ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਨਾ ਉਹ
ਆਦਤ ਸੀ ਤੇ ਮੈਂ ਤਾਂ ਚਾਹੇ ਚੂਹੇ ਨੇ ਖਾਇਆ ਹੋ ਚਾਹੇ ਬੰਦਰ ਨੇ ਖਾਇਆ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਦਿਓਗੇ ਤਾਂ ਮੈਂ ਜ਼ਰੂਰ ਖਾਵਾਂਗੀ. Those are very interesting things about what you can't say. Sometimes you are showing that with the way that you are taking up these, taking up these things.
ਇਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਇੱਕ ਹੋਰ ਚੀਜ਼ again if some Anchal you could put up Salim Lodi Saab, yeah, textbooks on both sides are infected bias. ਜਿਹੜਾ knowledge ਹੈ ਉਹ does scream the flame of hatred alight. Sane voices must come forward to clear the misconceptions. Salim Lodi Saab, he was the director of a National Archive, and he's compiled, I think, oral histories from partition as well. So, and this also kind of ties in ਜਿਹੜਾ ਉਹ question ਹੋ ਰਿਹਾ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਜੀ ਇਹਦਾ ਅਸੀਂ ਜਿਹੜਾ I don't know ਕਿ ਜੀ ਮੈਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਸਟੂਡੈਂਟਸ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਕਰਨ ਦੇ ਆ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਕੀ ਲੱਗ ਰਿਹਾ ਹਜੇ ਹੈ ਇਹਦਾ ਮਤਲਬ ਕਿ ਜੀ ਹੁਣ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਵਿੱਚੋਂ ਲੱਗਦਾ ਕਿ ਮੇਬੀ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ ਜ਼ਰੂਰਤ ਹੈ ਕਰਨ ਦੀ ਇਨ ਟਰਮਸ ਆਫ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਪੋਲੀਟੀਕਲ ਸੋਸ਼ਲ ਜੋ ਵੀ ਹੈ ਵਾ ਕਲਾਈਮੇਟ ਵਗੈਰਾ ਹੋਇਆ ਦਾ ਵਾ that and again maybe ਤੁਹਾਡਾ different ਹੋ ਜਾਂਦਾ as you are someone ਕਿ ਜੀ again was born on this side of again ਜਿਹੜਾ divide ਦਾ ਵਾ ਤੇ ਕੁਛ ਨਾ ਕੁਛ ਕਿਤੇ ਨਾ ਕਿਤੇ ਕਨੈਕਸ਼ਨ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਵਾ ਉਹ ਜਗ੍ਹਾ ਦਾ ਬੰਦਾ just as my mother's family was from ਗੁਰਦਾਸਪੁਰ ਤੇ ਇਹ ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਅੱਗੇ ਕਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਮਤਲਬ ਕਿ ਜੀ ਅਗੇਨ ਬੁక్స్ ਤੋਂ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ ਕੁਝ are there ways for us to kind of maybe even subvert the primarily the way that knowledge is kind of maybe passed forward or shared more than books. ਉਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਵਾ ਪਾਰਟੀਸ਼ਨ ਆਰਕਾਈਵ ਵਾਲਾ ਆਈ ਥਿੰਕ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਇਸ ਲਈ ਇੰਪੋਰਟੈਂਟ ਲੱਗ ਜਾਂਦਾ ਵਾ that you hear people's stories and if you don't read their names you wouldn't even know ਕਿ ਕਿਹਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਹੋ ਰਹੀ ਹੈ that then you are able to kind of connect with people and ਉਹ ਇਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਇਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਹੋਇਆ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਜੀ ਮੈਂ ਆਪਣੀ ਡਾਕੂਮੈਂਟਰੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਹੈ ਉਹ ਤੇ ਪਟਿਆਲਾ ਵਿੱਚ ਦਿਖਾਈ ਤੇ this young Sikh student ਹੋਇਆ ਕਹਿੰਦਾ ਸਾਰੇ ਤੇ ਇਹ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਬੋਲਣ ਦੇ ਸੀ ਤੇ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਆਪਣੀ ਨਾਨੀ ਵਾਂਗਰ ਦੀ ਲੱਗ ਰਹੀ ਹੈ ਠੀਕ ਹੈ ਲੇਕਿਨ ਉਹ ਪ੍ਰੋਬਬਲੀ ਇਸ ਲਈ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਜੋ ਨਾਨੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਔਰਤ ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਕਰ ਰਹੀ ਸੀ ਉਹ ਮੇਬੀ ਇੱਥੇ ਲੁਧਿਆਣਾ ਪਟਿਆਲਾ ਇਹ ਜਗ੍ਹਾ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਉਹ ਮੂਵ ਹੋਏ ਦੇ ਸਨ ਸੋ ਕੁਐਸਚਨ ਇਜ਼ ਕਿ ਜੀ ਸਿਰਫ ਬੁੱਕਸ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਹੀ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਰਿਲਾਈ ਕਰਨਾ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ ਜਾਂ ਆਰ ਦੇਅਰ ਵੇਜ਼ one can maybe challenge this ਹੁਣ ਜਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਸੋਸ਼ਲ ਮੀਡੀਆ ਹੋਇਆ ਦਾ ਟੈਕਨੋਲੋਜੀ ਹੋਈ ਦੀ ਹੈ are there new forms of knowledge ਜਿਹਦੇ ਨਾਲ disseminate ਹੋ ਸਕਦਾ ਵਾ ਮੈਸੇਜ ਅਬਾਊਟ partition
मतलब either or तो नहीं है in the sense के you know the time frame for which books are written and remember books are very threatening to dictators and now to democratic dictators right so in India right now the kind of repression against those who want to kind of do research Pakistan ਤੇ ਹੈ ਵਿੱਚ ਵੀ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਜੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਬਾਹਰ ਰਿਸਰਚ ਕਰਨਾ ਚਾਹੁੰਦੇ ਹੋ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਐਕਸਟਰਨਲ ਅਫੇਅਰਸ ਮਿਨਿਸਟਰੀ ਤੋਂ ਹਰ ਕੁਐਸਚਨ ਤੇ ਪਰਮਿਸ਼ਨ ਲੈਣੀ ਪਏਗੀ ਤੇ ਇੰਡੀਆ ਵਿੱਚ ਤਾਂ ਸਿੱਧਾ ਹੀ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਜੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਬਾਹਰੋਂ ਆਏ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਅਸੀਂ 에어ਪੋਰਟ ਤੋਂ ਵਾਪਸ ਭੇਜ ਦਿਆਂਗੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਇਹ ਲਿਖਿਆ ਤੇ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਅਸੀਂ ਜੇਲ੍ਹ ਵਿੱਚ ਦੇ ਦਿਆਂਗੇ ਤਾਂ ਸੈਡੀਸ਼ਨ ਹੋ ਗਿਆ right so there's clearly something threatening about books right otherwise they would not evoke the kind of reactions that they do. Now, that doesn't mean that they have an immediate impact, right? It is true that ਸਾਰੇ ਮਤਲਬ ਪ੍ਰੋਫੈਸਰ ਹੁਣ ਇਹੀ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਆ ਕਿ ਜੀ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਇੰਨੇ ਵੱਡੀ ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਜੋ ਅਗਰ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਪੜ੍ਹਨ ਨੂੰ ਕਹੋ ਤੇ ਸਟੂਡੈਂਟਸ ਕਰਨਾ ਨਹੀਂ ਚਾਹੁੰਦੇ ਜੀ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਪੜ੍ਹਨ ਦੀ ਆਦਤ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੈ ਤੇ ਫਿਰ ਮੇਰਾ ਕੁਐਸਚਨ ਹੈ ਵੀ ਆਦਤ ਪਾਓ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ right so that you're not just satisfied with saying here is one image here is one answer one thing on the other hand there is also power of images there is power of documentaries there is power of media and I think the new media environment मैं एक class पढ़ा रही थी ते this is some years ago I said something about the Arab Spring and I saw this class this is not good these were young undergraduates go blank. So I said, you know what the Arab Spring is, blank. So have you heard the word, blank? So I asked one of them, where do you get your news from? They get it either on Facebook or actually one of them said something very interesting. She said, I feel overwhelmed when I see the news. But I only take, I only ask my pastor, what view should I take of the news, right? This is a return in a certain sense of saying, I don't trust my judgment anymore. I need somebody else to give me the true judgment on that. And I think these are crises. I mean, the crisis of education is a huge crisis, partly because of all the metrics that have come into being by which you're being evaluated really by things that are constantly subject to gaming. ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਚ ਕਿੰਨੇ citation ਹੈ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਕਿੰਨਾ ਕਿੰਨਾ ਹੋਇਆ ਕਿ ਤੁਸੀਂ
Professor, oh, yes,
yeah,
citations, yes.
and the problem is that these are always gamed. I mean, there was Marios has written a very nice book, Gaming the Metrics, where he shows that how journals came to an agreement to say, ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਮਿਲਿਆ ਹੋਏਗਾ ਮੈਂ ਤੁਸੀਂ submit ਕੀਤਾ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਕਿਹਾ ਪਰ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਨਾ ਇਹ ਵਾਲੇ ਜਰਨਲ ਤੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਅੱਛੇ ਅੱਛੇ ਆਰਟੀਕਲ ਸੀ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਸਾਈਟ ਨਹੀਂ ਕੀਤਾ right. That's also a use of saying that you are not aiding us to include
Yeah.
our to enhance our citation rate, right, or our impact rate. So somewhere I think that we have to think very hard on where is knowledge going to be produced, and that's not just about the partition. I think that's just about being able to say we will always not be able to see what is before our eyes. The present is always a very difficult category to work in. But nevertheless, I think that the actual repression on forms of knowledge is absolutely appalling. It's something where I just feel that this is the one thing where where if we don't actually push on our right to be able to teach students, critically, and by critically, I don't mean just the left progressive or, but just to be able to think for themselves in, whatever ways, we're really failing.
ਇਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਅਗਲਾ ਮੈਂ ਸਵਾਲ ਪੁੱਛਣਾ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਹੁਣ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਐਜ਼ ਯੂ ਸੈਡ ਕਿ ਦੀ ਪਾਰਟੀਸ਼ਨ ਦਾ ਆਲਮੋਸਟ ਕਾਈਂਡ ਆਫ not just academic but ਜਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਵੀ ਹੈ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਆਪਣਾ ਵੀ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਇਟਸ ਅ ਪਰਸਨਲ ਥਿੰਗ ਇਟਸ ਜਾਂ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਉਹ ਜਿਹੜਾ poisoned knowledge ਵਾਲਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ kind of concept ਹੋ ਜਾਂਦੇ ਹੋ ਕਿ ਜੀ ਇੱਕ ਦਫਾ ਉਹ be it in this case knowledge about partition ਉਹਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਇਨਫੈਕਟ ਹੋ ਜਾਂਦੀ you are not really able to kind of get it out of your system ਤੇ ਉਹ ਚੀਜ਼ ਰਹਿੰਦੀ ਹੈ so each time you try to kind of you attempt in a clumsy way ਕਿ ਕੋਈ ਆਨਸਰ ਕਰ ਲੈ ਬੰਦਾ ਉਹ ਹੋਰ ਸਵਾਲ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਨੇ ਨਾ ਉਹ ਨਿਕਲ ਆਉਂਦੇ ਨੇ ਲੇਕਿਨ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਕੋਲ ਮੈਂ ਪੁੱਛਣਾ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਅੱਗੇ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਵਾ ਪਾਰਟੀਸ਼ਨ ਦੇ ਰਿਲੇਟਡ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਕਿਹੜੀ ਕੋਈ ਇੰਟਰਸਟਿੰਗ ਚੀਜ਼ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਹੋ ਜਿਹਦਾ ਕੋਈ ਥੋੜਾ ਜਿਹਾ ਪ੍ਰੀਵਿਊ ਵਗੈਰਾ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਦੱਸਣਾ ਹੋਵੇ ਐਨੀਥਿੰਗ ਦੈਟ ਯੂ ਹੈਵ ਇਨ ਮਾਈਂਡ ਵਿਚ ਮੇਬੀ ਅੱਗੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਸੋਚ ਰਹੇ ਹੋ ਕੋਈ ਪਾਰਟੀਸ਼ਨ ਦਾ ਐਂਡ ਉਹਦੇ ਬਾਅਦ ਮੈਂ ਲਾਸਟ ਸਵਾਲ ਸੌਰੀ ਆਈ ਨੋ ਕਾਫੀ ਲੰਬਾ ਹੋ ਗਿਆ ਮੈਂ ਲਾਸਟ ਸਵਾਲ ਪੁੱਛਾਂਗਾ but anything that you're kind of thinking about partition wise research ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਜਾਂ ਕੋਈ ਚੀਜ਼ ਕੋਈ interesting question
Well, I don't plan questions. Usually they come to me because of something that happened. So one of the issues that, when I was, the last paper I wrote is just finished. It's actually on academia edu. It's called Affecting and Affecting Emotions. And it's a question of saying, is emotion added from the outside to language, or is it something which is within language? And I was struck by the fact, so it starts with, with the question of ordinary language, philosophy, Austin, Cavell, etc. And it looks at Cavell's notions about passionate statement, which was all about love talk, right? But it then goes to Abhinav Gupta and Panini to stage a certain conversation to make, Indian philosophy more easily, something that one can have a conversation with. And my example of passionate statement just from the literature came upon the curse, right? Because the origin of poetry in Sanskrit is said to be with the emergence of a curse from Valmiki. This was this Manishad Pratishthantam Agama Shashwati Samaha. Yeah. So that was a curse. And there's a lot of things to say, but a text should begin with the auspicious, auspicious event and auspicious poem. Why does Valmiki begin with the curse? And what does it mean to make the curse something which is the origin of poetry? And I think profound idea, really, to say, how do we see that this kind of bitterness of, what has happened, don't become a curse on the world. This is what has happened with the Hindu right, that one, they will not bear to read properly or to understand or to be open to the Sanskrit tradition. ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਨਾ ਜੇ ਰਾਮ ਨੂੰ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਕਿਉਂ ਕ੍ਰਿਟਿਸਾਈਜ਼ ਕੀਤਾ, ਤੇ ਸੰਸਕ੍ਰਿਤ ਟ੍ਰੈਡੀਸ਼ਨ ਤਾਂ ਪੱਤੀ ਹੈ ਇਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ. Even Valmiki says says at one point that whatever the virtues of Ram in Kalidas makes him say that, his expulsion of Sita, and he does it by the use of a particle. ਚਾਹੇ ਜਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਪੰਜਾਬੀ ਵਿੱਚ ਕਹਾਂਗੇ ਨਾ ਜੀ, ਚਾਹੇ ਜਿੰਨਾ ਵੀ ਕੀਤਾ ਹੋਏ ਉਹਨੇ, ਹਾਂ ਰਾਵਣ ਨੂੰ ਮਾਰਿਆ, ਉਹਨੇ ਇਹ ਵੀ ਕੀਤਾ, ਬੜਾ ਮੋਡੈਸਟ, ਬੜੇ ਮੋਡੈਸਟ ਸਨ ਰਾਮ, ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਉਹ ਭੁੱਲ ਜਾਂਦੇ ਸਨ ਕਿ ਹੀ ਇਜ਼ ਗੋਡ, ਵੈਰੀ ਇੰਟਰਸਟਿੰਗਲੀ. ਇਹ ਜੋ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਸੀਤਾ ਨੂੰ ਐਕਸਪਲਸ਼ਨ ਦਿੱਤੀ ਹੈ ਨਾ, ਉਹਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਮੇਰੇ ਮਨ ਵਿੱਚ ਉਸੇ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਦਾ ਐਂਗਰ ਆ ਰਿਹਾ ਹੈ, ਜਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਮੈਂ ਉਹ ਜਦ ਕ੍ਰਾਂਚ ਬਰਡ ਨੂੰ ਮਾਰਿਆ ਗਿਆ ਸੀ, ਜੋ ਗੁੱਸਾ ਤਦ ਆਇਆ ਸੀ, ਉਹੀ ਗੁੱਸਾ ਮੇਰੇ ਅੰਦਰ ਆ ਰਿਹਾ ਹੈ, ਰਾਈਟ? This is such a devastating critique. To say all his good works are really done away with because of this one unjust act, right? But you cannot get them to see it. Forget about the fact that they will not actually entertain what the Jain Ramayana says. They will not entertain what what the tribal Ramayans say in relationship to the same characters and the same plots, right? So in one way, it seems to me that there is a kind of, it's not just absence of knowledge, it's a certain kind of hold of ignorance now that I find quite astounding. I mean, my mother never went to school, for instance, right? But she could immediately have which hai na ek proverb ke ਮੁੰਡੇ ਨੂੰ ਕਹਿੰਦੀ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਜੀ ਤੂੰ ਆਬ ਕਹਿੰਦਾ ਰਿਹਾ, ਤੂੰ ਅਗਰ ਪਾਣੀ ਪਾਣੀ ਕਹਿੰਦਾ ਤੇ ਮੈਂ ਬਾਲਟੀ ਭਰ ਭਰ ਪਾਣੀ
ਕਹਿ ਕੇ ਬਦਲੀ ਮੁੰਡਾ ਮਰਿਆ, ਫਾਰਸੀਆਂ ਪੜ ਗਾਲੇ, ਸੋ ਪਤਾ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਆਬ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਪਾਣੀ ਤੇ ਮੈਂ ਦਿੰਦੀ ਭਰ ਭਰ ਗਾਲੇ.
That's right. Yeah, right. Now that is a certain way in which the idea that don't go just by the big words, go by what you are seeing, or what is there, what is the history of it, what is the sentiment, what is the literary in relationship to that, right? So I think that is a very profound issue here, that the more you say, oh, we've increased literacy, which is great, that we have more people going to school, which is great, right? But we somehow or the other are failing in being able to deal with the massive way in which ignorance has become so attractive to people.
ਚਲੋ ਹੁਣ ਇਹ ਅਸੀਂ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਲੱਗ ਰਿਹਾ ਬਹੁਤ ਸੀਰੀਅਸ ਗੱਲ ਹੈ. ਮੈਂ ਲਾਸਟ ਸਵਾਲ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਕੋਲ ਪੁੱਛਣਾ, ਤੁਸੀਂ ਲਾਹੌਰ ਕਦੋਂ ਆ ਰਹੇ ਹੋ? ਤੁਸੀਂ ਉਹ ਜ਼ਰਾ ਦੱਸੋ, ਹਾਂ ਲਾਹੌਰ ਦਾ ਕੋਈ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰਾਮ ਬਣ ਰਿਹਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਨਹੀਂ, ਕਿਤੇ ਚੱਕਰ ਲਾਓ ਨਾ?
Sorry, ਮੈਂ ਸਮਝ ਨਹੀਂ ਆਈ.
ਤੁਸੀਂ ਹੁਣ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਹੋ ਰਿਹਾ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਜੀ ਆਮ ਪ੍ਰੋਬਬਲੀ ਗੋਇੰਗ ਟੂ ਆਸਕ the last question, which is ਕਿ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਲਾਹੌਰ ਕਦੋਂ ਆ ਰਹੇ ਹੋ? ਕੋਈ ਲਾਹੌਰ ਦਾ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰਾਮ ਨਹੀਂ ਬਣਿਆ?
When I was leaving Lahore during this ਜਦ ਮੈਂ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਲਮਜ਼ ਆਈ ਸੀ, ਜਦ ਅਰਥਕੁਏਕ ਹੋਇਆ ਸੀ, ਤੇ ਜਦ ਮੈਂ ਜਾ ਰਹੀ ਸੀ ਤੇ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਨੇ ਵਾਰਨ ਕੀਤਾ ਸੀ, ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਮੈਂ ਕਾਫੀ ਸਾਰਾ ਮਿਊਜ਼ਿਕ ਵਗੈਰਾ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਜਾ ਰਹੀ ਸੀ, ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਤਾਂ ਪਕੜਨਗੇ ਕਸਟਮ ਵਾਲੇ. ਤੇ ਉਹ ਕਸਟਮ ਵਾਲੇ ਨੇ ਮੇਰਾ ਪਾਸਪੋਰਟ ਦੇਖਿਆ, ਬੌਰਨ ਇਨ ਲਾਹੌਰ, ਤੇ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਐਨੇ ਸਾਲ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਆਏ ਕਿਉਂ ਨਹੀਂ, ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਇੰਨਾ ਸਾਲ ਲੱਗ ਗਏ ਆਉਣ ਨੂੰ? ਤੇ ਮੈਂ ਕਿਹਾ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਇੰਨੇ ਸਾਲ ਲੱਗ ਗਏ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਬੁਲਾਉਣ ਨੂੰ?
would love to ਕੋਈ ਵੀ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰਾਮ ਵਗੈਰਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਵਾ ਅਗਰ ਉਹ ਹੋਵੇ ਲਾਹੌਰ, ਜਿਹੜਾ ਵਾ is I mean an honor ਕਿ ਜੀ ਅਸੀਂ ਲਮਜ਼ ਵਿੱਚ ਆਈਏ. ਐਂਡ ਅਗੇਨ ਯੂ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਕੰਮ ਕਰਨ ਦੇ ਦਿਓ, I think it is so fantastic. And ਇੱਥੇ ਰਮਜ਼ਾਨ ਹੋਇਆ ਤਾਂ ਰਮਜ਼ਾਨ ਵਿੱਚ ਬੰਦਾ ਇਹ ਦੁਆ ਕਰਦਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਜੀ ਅੱਲਾ ਮੀਆਂ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਲੰਮੀ ਉਮਰ ਦੇਵੇ, ਸਿਹਤ ਦੇਵੇ, and long may continue to work ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਕੰਮ ਕਰਨ ਦੇ ਦਿਓ. And it's been just an absolute honor for me. And again ਮੈਂ ਦੱਸ ਰਿਹਾ ਕਿ ਜੀ whenever I've had the opportunity, I've come away kind of just ਕਿ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਕਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ conceptualize ਕਰ ਸਕਦੇ ਹੋ. So just want to thank you so very much for taking the time out. I know you weren't feeling kind of तबीयत इतनी अच्छी नहीं हो रही थी, but even then, through your kindness, thank you so very much.
Well, thank
मैं
you for having me. ਅੱਗੇ ਹਮ ਅਗਰ ਅੱਛਾ ਹੋਏ ਤੇ ਅੱਛਾ ਹੋਏਗਾ, ਮੇਰੀ ਤੁਹਾਡੀ ਦੁਆ ਹੈ ਤੇ ਰੱਬ ਭਰੋਸੇ ਹੈ।
ਬਿਲਕੁਲ ਦਿਲ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚੋਂ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਨਾ ਉਹ ਦੁਆ ਹੈ। ਐਂਡ ਆਈ ਵੁੱਡ ਜਸਟ ਲਾਈਕ ਟੂ ਥੈਂਕ एवरीवन for tuning in. If you enjoy our oral history work, our mission, please consider making a donation of any size. We rely 100% on donations as an NGO. In some countries, donations are tax free. Links are in the description in this video. So once again, with profound thanks to Professor Veena, this is Furrukh Khan signing off from Lahore. Please do make sure to join us next Sunday in our Sunday Stories Live from Partition Archive 1947. So good evening, Sat Sri Akal, Namaste, and Assalamu Alaikum from Lahore.
Thank you.
Thank you.